I was married to Frank for 48 years. 3 months ago, I stood at his graveside, crying my heart out as I buried the man I thought was the love of my life, following a high-risk heart surgery. But today, I discovered that all of it was a lie. Our entire 48-year marriage was an act. His tragic death was actually a prearranged plan so he could disappear. And the woman my husband planned to run away with was my own aunt. If you are listening from anywhere in the world, please leave a comment and subscribe, because there are truths that need to be spread, even if they shake what you believe. There are stories, no matter how painful, that must be told. You see, I was married to Frank Thompson for 48 years. Imagine that. That's more time than many people live. We met when I was just 22 and he was 25. I was working at a small downtown diner on Dauphin Street. It was hard but honest work, and he was a construction worker. We weren't rich, but we never lacked the necessities. We got married in 1,974 inches, a simple wedding at the Cathedral Basilica of the Immaculate Conception with just 50 guests and a cake that my mother-in-law made with her own hands. I was born in 1951, right here in Mobile, into a humble family of 7 siblings. I was the third. My dad, Mr. Walter Miller, worked at a textile mill over in Pritchard, and my mom, Helen, was a homemaker and sometimes did sewing to help with expenses. We lived in a 2-room house in the Crichton neighborhood, where we all slept crammed together but happy. Those were difficult but beautiful times in their own way. I grew up watching my mom struggle every day to make sure there was food on the table. She taught me how to make biscuits from scratch when I was just 9 years old, and by the time I turned 12, I knew how to cook almost anything. My dad was a man of few words but a lot of work. He would leave the house at 5 inches the morning and come back when it was already dark, his hands covered in calluses and his body tired. But he always found the energy to ask us how our day at school had been. Of my siblings, I was especially close to my sister Catherine, who was 2 years older than me, and my younger brother Joey, who was 5 years younger. Catherine got married very young, at 17, to a boy from a town over in Mississippi, like Pascagoula, and went to live there. Joey studied until the 9th grade, and then learned the trade of a mechanic. My other siblings also made their own lives, each going their own way, but we always kept in touch, especially for holidays and birthdays. I only studied up to the 9th grade, no more. It's not that I didn't want to continue, but in those days, families like mine couldn't afford to keep so many children in school. By 15, I was already working full-time. First, helping out at a neighbor's convenience store. And then, when I turned 18, I got the job at the diner I mentioned before. It was tough work, with the heat of the griddle all day and the smell of dough sticking to your clothes. But I liked it because I earned my own money and could help my mom with the household expenses. Life in Mobile in those years was very different from how it is now. The city was smaller, everyone knew each other in the neighborhoods, and there was a sense of community that hardly exists anymore. On Sundays, we would go to Bienville Square to walk, buy ice cream cones, and sit on the benches to watch people go by. The girls my age dreamed of getting married and having our own families, because that's what was expected of us. There weren't as many options as there are now, but we didn't feel unhappy about it. It was simply the life we were given. My family was always very close, but we also had our problems like any large family. My dad sometimes drank a little too much on the weekends, although he was never violent or anything like that. He would just get sentimental and fall asleep in the living room. My mom would scold him the next day. He would promise it wouldn't happen again, and that's how they got by. My older brothers argued a lot among themselves, especially my brother Martin, who was the firstborn and always wanted to be in charge. But despite everything, when one of us had a problem, we were all there to support each other. Now I have to tell you about a person who is going to be very important in this story, my Aunt Sharon. She was my mom's younger sister, 26 years her junior. Aunt Sharon, as we affectionately called her, was a very peculiar woman. She never married. She said men only brought problems and that she was better off alone. She lived in a little house she rented near a flea market downtown. She worked cleaning houses for wealthy people in one of the fancy houses on Spring Hill and had a reputation for being a bit bitter. She wasn't an affectionate person. She almost never smiled, and when she spoke, she always seemed to be criticizing something or someone. Aunt Sharon also had no children, which she herself said was a blessing because that way she didn't have to worry about anyone but herself. That way of thinking always seemed sad to me, but that's how she was. She would come over for lunch on Sundays and always find something to complain about, that the soup was too salty, that it was too hot, that the kids were making too much noise. My mom put up with her because she was her sister, but I could tell that sometimes even she got frustrated with her. The funny thing is that Aunt Sharon was always very meddlesome in other people's lives, especially in matters of couples. When Catherine was going to get married, it was Aunt Sharon who told her that the boy wasn't right for her, that he was a good-for-nothing, although he turned out to be a good husband in the end. When my brother Martin divorced his first wife, Aunt Sharon went around telling everyone that she always knew that woman was no good. She was like that with everyone. She always had an opinion, always judged, but she never set an example for anything. It was precisely at the diner where I met Frank. He came in one day in March of 1973 to pick up lunch for his mom, who lived in the same neighborhood. He was a tall, tan man with large, strong hands from his construction work. He had a nice smile and brown eyes that sparkled when he talked. He wasn't the most handsome man in the world, but there was something about him that caught my attention from the very first moment. Frank started coming to the diner more often, always with some excuse that his mom needed extra food, that he wanted to buy something for his brothers, that he was just passing by. I played dumb at first, but the truth is, I started to like him too. He was attentive, polite, and always tried to make small talk while I was working. He would ask how my family was, what I had done on Sunday, if I liked working there. After several months of coming and going, he finally got up the nerve to ask me out. He asked if I wanted to go to the movies, that he would pay for everything. I said yes, but that I had to ask my dad for permission first. In those days, you couldn't just go out with a boy without your parents knowing. Frank came to the house, spoke very respectfully with my dad, and my dad gave him permission, but on the condition that he have me back home before 9 at night. That's how we started dating. We went to the movies on Sundays. Sometimes we would walk through Bienville Square or sit on a park bench and talk. Frank told me about his work in construction, his plans to one day have his own crew of workers, about the house he wanted to build. I told him about my family, my dreams of having children, of wanting a quiet and happy life. We understood each other well, we laughed together, and after a year and a half of dating, he asked me to marry him. The wedding was simple, but beautiful. I wore a white dress that my cousin Diane lent me, and Frank wore a dark suit he rented downtown. The ceremony was at the Cathedral Basilica of the Immaculate Conception with Father Michael, who had known my family since we were kids. After the Mass, we went to my mom's house, where they had prepared gumbo, rice, and cornbread for all the guests. There was no live music because we couldn't afford it, but we played records on a record player that my brother Martin managed to borrow, and we danced until late. We went to live in a small room we rented in a little apartment over in Tolmanville, near where Frank was working at the time. It was tiny, barely big enough for a bed, a dresser, and a small table to eat at, but for us, it was our palace. I left my job at the diner because Frank wanted me to be a homemaker, and although at first it was hard for me to get used to being cooped up all day, I gradually started to enjoy it. I dedicated myself to keeping the house clean, to cooking, to waiting for Frank to come home from work. A year after we got married, our first daughter, Jessica, was born. It was a difficult birth. I was in labor for over 18 hours, but when I saw her for the first time, I felt it had all been worth it. She was a beautiful, chubby baby with a lot of black hair. Frank was so happy, he even cried when he held her. 2 years later, our son Austin arrived, and 4 years after that, the youngest, Emily. With 3 kids, life got tighter financially, but Frank always found a way to bring money home. Those first years of marriage were good. I won't lie. Frank was hardworking, responsible. He came home every day. He gave me the full grocery money without asking for an account of every dollar. Yes, he drank beer on the weekends with his buddies, but he was never a drunk or violent. We had our arguments like any couple, about money, about how to raise the kids, about silly things sometimes, but nothing serious. I thought we were a normal family, that we would grow old together surrounded by grandchildren. What I didn't know, what I never suspected during all those years, was that my life was a lie, constructed so carefully that not even I could see the cracks, and the person who helped me discover the truth was the last one I would have ever imagined. It sounds like a normal, happy life, doesn't it? The tiny apartment, the new babies, but Patricia just told us it was all a lie. It's a chilling thought, that the very foundation of your world is a fraud, and the person who reveals it, well, let's just say it's the last person anyone would suspect. For the next 20 years, my life was the typical routine of any working-class woman in Mobile. I would get up at 5 inches the morning to make Frank's breakfast. I'd make biscuits on the griddle, heat up the grits, make coffee in the pot. Frank would leave at 6 for whatever construction site he was working on at the moment, sometimes in Mobile itself, sometimes in more distant areas like Theodore or Saraland. The kids went to the local elementary school, Leinkauf Elementary, which was 5 blocks from the house. I would wake them up, bathe them, give them breakfast, and send them off clean with their uniforms ironed. After that, I'd do the housework, washing clothes by hand in the wash basin in the backyard, mopping, dusting. At noon, I'd prepare lunch, always trying to vary the menu, although the truth is I almost always ended up making the same things: chicken and dumplings, pulled pork, meatloaf, fried chicken, dirty rice, macaroni and cheese. Frank would get home between 3 and 4 inches the afternoon, eat, take a shower, and if he didn't have to go back to the job site, he'd watch TV or go to the corner store to chat with the neighbors. The kids would get back from school at 2, do their homework after eating, and then go out to play in the street with the other kids on the block. It was a simple, predictable life, without many excitements, but I was happy. I had my family, my house, my routine. On weekends, we'd go to the market to do the weekly shopping. Frank would carry the bags while I haggled with the vendors over the price of tomatoes and onions. We'd buy meat from Mr. Davis's butcher shop, chicken from Miss Rose's stand, vegetables from Mr. Peterson, who always gave me an extra bunch of cilantro because he liked me. Afterward, we'd stop by the bakery for dinner rolls and a sweet potato pie for the week. On Sundays, we'd go to 11 o'clock Mass at the parish and then stay in the churchyard chatting with other families. Frank would go with his buddies to a local bar, the Rusty Anchor, for a few beers, and I'd go back home to prepare lunch. In the afternoons, we'd sometimes visit my mom, or she'd come to our house with my siblings. My dad had already passed away by then. In 1986, he had a massive heart attack at the mill, and they couldn't get him to the hospital in time. Aunt Sharon continued to be a part of our family gatherings, though she seemed more bitter and lonely with each passing year. She was about 30 by then, and still hadn't married. She had stopped cleaning houses and now worked at a fabric store downtown, like Joann's, where she served customers with a sour face. My mom would invite her to lunch every Sunday, and she would always arrive with her long face and her negative comments about everything. The strange thing is that, over the years, Aunt Sharon started visiting my house more often. At first I thought it was because she was lonely, but now, looking back, I realized she had other intentions. She would show up unannounced, sometimes during the week, with the excuse that she was just passing by or wanted to see the kids. She would sit in the living room and stay for hours, chatting about anything and everything. And I thought I was doing her a favor because the poor woman had no one else. Frank seemed to get along with her. He spoke to her respectfully, asked her how she was, sometimes even offered her a beer if she came on the weekend. Aunt Sharon would get weird when he was around, kind of nervous, and I thought it was just her usual awkwardness around men. Never, not once, did it cross my mind that there was something more going on there. During those years, Frank changed jobs several times. He started working with a construction crew, then he had his own small crew for a while. Then he went back to being a helper when things got tough with the economic crisis of the 82nds. There were good times when he brought home good money, and bad times when we barely had enough for the basics, but we always managed. Over time, we were able to buy a small plot of land in the Oakley neighborhood, where we live now. It was a 2,000-square-foot lot, not very big, but enough. Frank himself built the house little by little, First one room and a small kitchen, then adding more rooms as the children were born and as we had the money. By 1998, we had a house with 3 bedrooms, a living room, a dining room, a kitchen, and a full bathroom. It wasn't a mansion, but it was ours. The children were growing up. Jessica was very diligent in school, always got good grades. Austin was more mischievous. It was hard for him to sit still, but he had a kind heart. Emily was Frank's favorite, the youngest, and he spoiled her rotten. I tried to raise them with values to be respectful, hardworking, not to lie, to help around the house. I don't know if I did it right or wrong, but all 3 of them turned out to be good people. Jessica got married when she was 22 to a young man who worked at a bank. They went to live in Fairhope. Austin studied through high school and then got a job at a shipyard that opened in Mobile. Emily finished high school and started working as a secretary in a lawyer's office. By the year 2005, they were all out of the house, living their own lives. It was when the kids left that I started to notice some strange things about Frank, things I hadn't noticed before or maybe hadn't wanted to see. He started coming home late more often than usual, always with excuses that he had a lot of work or that he had gone to quote a job somewhere. He started to be more distant with me, as if his mind was elsewhere. Sometimes I would catch him staring into space, looking pensive, and when I asked him what was wrong, he would say nothing, just that he was tired. He also started showering more often. Before, he would come home from the construction site all grimy and shower once when he got home. But now, sometimes he would shower twice a day and even put on some cologne I gave him for Christmas that he never used to wear. His boxers sometimes smelled of a perfume that wasn't mine, a sweet scent I didn't recognize. When I asked him about it, he'd say he had hugged a female friend at a party or that he had been at a client's house and smelled their air fresheners. I know. You're probably thinking, Patricia, how could you be so blind? But you see, when you've trusted a man for over 25 years, you want to believe him. It's easier to believe a clumsy lie than to admit your entire life might be a fraud. Have you ever fooled yourself like that, just to keep the peace? He started going out more on weekends with the excuse of going to quote jobs. He would tell me that a client wanted him to come see their house to estimate the cost of a remodel, that he had to go on Sunday because it was the only day the man was home. I believed him because I had never had a reason to doubt him. Sometimes he would leave in the morning and not come back until night. And when I asked him how it went, he would give me vague explanations that the job was very big, that the man wanted a lot of things, that he had to go back next week to take more measurements. There was one time I saw him talking with Aunt Sharon on the street corner, about 2 blocks from our house. I was coming back from the market and saw them standing there, very close, talking as if in secret. When they saw me coming, they separated quickly, and Aunt Sharon went the other way. When I asked Frank what he was doing there with her, he said he had run into her by chance and was asking about my mom's health. It seemed strange, but I didn't think much of it. Another time, Aunt Sharon came to the house when Frank was alone because I had gone to help Jessica, who had just given birth. When I came back 3 days later, Frank was acting strange, nervous. I asked him if something had happened and he said no, that everything had been quiet, that Aunt Sharon had stopped by for a visit but had left quickly. I thought it was strange that Aunt Sharon would come to visit Frank when I wasn't there, but I didn't pay it much mind either. In 2012, my mom got very sick with severe diabetes. She had complications, and they had to amputate her foot. She was in USA Health University Hospital for almost a month, and all of us siblings took turns taking care of her. Aunt Sharon also went to see her, but she didn't stay long because she said hospitals made her sad. I spent almost the whole day there, and Frank would come at night after work to keep me company for a while. It was during that time that I noticed Frank and Aunt Sharon almost never coincided at the hospital. If Aunt Sharon was there, Frank arrived late. If Frank was there, Aunt Sharon left early. I thought it was a coincidence, that they simply had different work schedules. My mom recovered well from the surgery and left the hospital, but she remained in delicate health and needed a lot of care. Frank started offering to take things to my mom a lot. He would tell me he could drop off her medicine or groceries, not to worry, that he'd do it on his way to a job site. I was grateful because, honestly, with the housework and my own aches and pains, it was sometimes hard for me to be going back and forth to my mom's house every day. What I didn't know was that sometimes when he was supposedly going to my mom's house, he was actually going somewhere else. There was one day in particular, in February of 2015, that Frank told me he had a very big job in Fairhope, that he was going to be there all week and would only come home on weekends. He told me the client was going to pay him very well, but he needed to dedicate himself full-time to that project. I didn't see anything strange. It was normal for him to have to work out of town sometimes. He gave me money for the week and left on Monday morning with his small suitcase. It turns out that on Wednesday, I went to Fairhope to visit Jessica because it was my oldest grandson's birthday. We were in her backyard when one of Frank's partners, a man named Wayne, drove by in his pickup truck. Jessica knew him because Frank had once taken her to a job site where he was working with Wayne. We yelled to say hello, and when he saw us, he stopped. I asked him about Frank. I asked if he knew where the job site was, because I wanted to bring him a meal I had prepared. Wayne looked at me with a confused expression and told me he didn't know about any job in Fairhope, that the last time he had seen Frank was last Saturday in Mobile. I laughed nervously and told him that maybe it was with another partner, not him. And Wayne left, but something inside me broke at that moment. When Frank came back on Friday, I casually asked him how the job in Fairhope had gone. He told me a ton of details, that the client was very demanding, that the house was very large, that they had paid him in advance. As he spoke, I watched him, and for the first time in over 35 years of knowing him, I felt like I didn't know the man in front of me. I stayed quiet. I didn't tell him what Wayne had told me, but I couldn't sleep that night. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to him snore beside me. A cold dread, like spiders crawling up my spine, settled in my heart. This was the man who held my hand when Jessica was born. This was the man who built our home with his own hands. And yet, the ease with which he lied to me made me feel like a stranger in my own bed. A terrible, lonely thought entered my mind for the first time. I don't know this person. I quickly pushed it away, telling myself I was being foolish, that I was a paranoid old woman, that I was ungrateful for the good man God gave me. It was easier to believe I was crazy than to believe my entire life was a lie. Right there, that very night. I should have stopped. I should have faced it head on. But I didn't, you see. I chose to believe I was the crazy one. Sometimes the truth is just too terrifying. It feels safer to stay blind than to open your eyes and see it. That was a weakness I paid for dearly. It's a painful choice, isn't it? To convince yourself you're the crazy one just to keep the peace. Patricia buried her suspicion, but that single lie was a crack in the foundation of her entire life, a crack that is about to shatter. Keep listening to hear what happens next. That was the choice I made, again and again, for years. The next day, I went to my brother Joey's house and told him what had happened. Joey told me not to jump to conclusions, that maybe it was a misunderstanding, that maybe Wayne was confused, but I knew something wasn't right. I decided to start paying more attention to Frank's things, his schedules, his explanations, his movements. Over the next few months, I found more strange things. Gas receipts from gas stations, far from any job site he supposedly had. One day, I found a piece of paper in his pants pocket with a phone number written on it and a little heart drawn next to it. When I asked whose it was, he said it was a client's number, that the client's little daughter had drawn the heart. The explanation sounded ridiculous, but I wanted to believe him. In December of 2016, my mother passed away. She was 86 years old, and her heart simply grew tired. It was a hard blow for everyone, especially for Aunt Sharon, who was left completely alone in the world. At the wake and the funeral, I noticed that Frank was very attentive to Aunt Sharon. He brought her coffee, offered her tissues, sat by her side to comfort her. I thought it was because he felt sorry for her, because he knew she was the one left most alone without my mom. After the funeral, Aunt Sharon became very depressed. She stopped going to work for a while. She hardly left her house. She didn't answer the phone. I went to visit her often because I felt bad seeing her like that. I would bring her food, force her to shower and get dressed. Frank went to see her too. He said he wanted to help her fix some leaks she had in her roof. He would offer to bring her things from the market, to accompany her to the bank to cash her pension check that she had started receiving after 30 years of work. The relationship between Frank and Aunt Sharon became increasingly close. They talked on the phone often. He would call her to ask how she was. When I mentioned to him that I found so much attention from my aunt strange, he would say that the poor woman was very lonely and someone had to take care of her, that after all, she was family. I felt guilty for thinking badly, for suspecting anything strange between my husband and my aunt, who was already about 60 years old by then. In March of 2019, Frank told me he had been offered a very good job up near Birmingham on a large construction project that was going to last several months. He explained that the pay was excellent, but he had to be there from Monday to Friday, that he would only come home on weekends. I didn't know what to think anymore. Was it true, or was it another lie? But we needed the money because Emily was about to get married, and we wanted to help her with the wedding expenses. During those months he was supposedly working in Birmingham, I felt more and more lonely and confused. Frank would arrive on Friday nights and leave on Monday mornings. When he was home, he seemed tired, distracted, as if his mind was somewhere else. We made love less and less, and when we did, it felt mechanical, without passion, as if he were fulfilling an obligation. One Saturday in August, Aunt Sharon didn't come to the monthly family lunch we had at my sister Catherine's house. She said she was sick with the flu. Frank didn't go either. He said his back hurt a lot, and he preferred to stay home and rest. I went to the lunch alone and stayed there until about 7 inches the evening. When I got home, Frank was watching TV very calmly. Something made me call Aunt Sharon to see how her flu was. I called and called, but she didn't answer. The next day I went to see her, and when I arrived, she was perfectly fine, with no sign of the flu. I asked her how she felt, and she said she was better, that it had been something mild. But something in the way she spoke, in her eyes, made me suspect she was lying. I started to feel a knot in my stomach that wouldn't go away. In September of that year, the Birmingham job supposedly ended, and Frank went back to working in Mobile. But his hours were still strange. He'd arrive late, go out on weekends with excuses that sounded less and less believable. I was on the verge of desperation, but I didn't know what to do. I had no proof of anything, just a lot of suspicions and a horrible feeling in my chest. The following years were a nightmare of doubts and suspicions that ate me up inside. Every time Frank left the house, I wondered where he was really going, who he was with, what he was doing. Every time his phone rang and he walked away to answer, I felt my heart was going to jump out of my chest. Every time I smelled a strange perfume on his clothes, I felt like I was suffocating. I started doing things I never thought I would do. I checked his pockets when he showered, looking for receipts, papers, anything that would give me a clue. I checked the mileage on his truck to see if it matched the places he said he had been. Once I even followed him when he said he was going to a job site in the Crichton neighborhood. And he did go there, but that didn't calm me down because I knew he could be telling the truth sometimes and lying others. I asked Emily to teach me how to use Facebook because I had heard that people post everything they do on there. I created an account with a fake name and searched for Frank, but he didn't have a Facebook page, or at least not under his real name. I looked for Aunt Sharon, and she didn't show up either. I felt foolish, like a ridiculous old woman trying to spy on her husband online. I spoke to my daughters without telling them the details. I just asked if they had noticed anything strange about their dad. Jessica told me he seemed the same as always, that maybe I was stressed and that's why I was seeing things that weren't there. Emily said that her dad had indeed been a bit strange lately, quieter, as if he was worried, but that it was probably because of work being difficult. Neither of them imagined what I was thinking. In February of 2022, my world was shaken in a way I never imagined. Frank came home one night with terrible news. He told me he had been feeling very sick, with chest pains and shortness of breath. He had gone to the doctor and they had done some tests. The results were devastating. He had a serious heart problem, a severe aortic aneurysm that could rupture at any moment. The doctor told him he needed urgent surgery, but that it was very risky, that he only had a 50% chance of survival. I fell apart when I heard that. Suddenly, all my suspicions took a back seat. The only thing that mattered was that my husband, the father of my children, the man with whom I had spent 48 years of my life, was in danger of dying. I started to cry like I had never cried before. I clung to him and asked for his forgiveness for having doubted him, for having thought badly of him, for not having been a better wife. I told him I loved him, that I couldn't imagine my life without him. Frank was crying too, holding me tight and telling me not to worry, that he was strong, that he was going to get through this. He asked me to be strong for him, for our children, for our grandchildren. He made me promise that if anything happened to him, I would go on, that I wouldn't let myself sink into sadness. I'm sure when you heard that, you thought it was strange, too. Why keep delaying the surgery? Why was he saying goodbyes like that? At the time, I just thought he was scared of dying, but looking back now, it gives me a cold chill. He was crying, not because he was scared of death, but because he was putting on a show. He was saying his real goodbyes so he could disappear. That night we slept in each other's arms, and I didn't sleep a wink, just watched him breathe and prayed to God not to take him from me. The next few days were a whirlwind. We told the kids, and they were devastated. Jessica couldn't stop crying. Austin looked shattered, though he tried to be strong. Emily was in shock. We all wanted to be with Frank at the hospital for the surgery. We called all the relatives, friends, and buddies. Everyone who loved us was praying for Frank. Aunt Sharon found out too. She came to the house, a mess of tears, hugged Frank, and said she couldn't believe what was happening, that it was a great injustice. Frank comforted her, telling her everything would be okay, that he had faith. I watched that scene and felt terrible about myself for ever having suspected that there could be something strange between them. It was obvious they loved each other as family, nothing more. The surgery was scheduled for April 15th, 2022. Frank kept postponing it with different excuses, that he wanted to sort out some pending matters, that he needed to finish a job, that he wanted to enjoy a little more time with the family. The doctors told him he couldn't wait much longer, that every day that passed was more dangerous. But Frank insisted on waiting a bit more. During those months, Frank dedicated himself to putting all his affairs in order. He went to a lawyer and made a will. He explained everything to me. The house had been in my name for years, so that wasn't a problem. But there were savings in the bank that he wanted to be divided among our 3 children. He also had a life insurance policy through his job that I would collect if he died. He showed me where he kept all the important papers, the deeds, the receipts, everything. He said goodbye to all his friends as if he knew he wasn't coming back. He had a barbecue at the house and invited all his buddies, his partners, the neighbors. It was a sad and happy day at the same time, everyone trying to keep their spirits up, but with heavy hearts. Frank gave his friends advice, telling them to take care of their families, not to put off until tomorrow what they could do today. He had very deep conversations with his children. He told Austin that he was the man of the family now, that he had to take care of me and his sisters. He told Jessica he was proud of the woman and mother she had become. To Emily, his favorite, he said he loved her more than anything in the world, and the 2 of them cried in each other's arms for hours. He told me every day that I had been the best wife a man could ask for, that he had been very happy by my side, that he didn't regret anything. Finally, the day of the surgery arrived. It was a Friday. We went to the hospital very early. Frank had to be there at 7 inches the morning. We all arrived. Me, our 3 children with their partners, several of my siblings, some close friends. Aunt Sharon was there too, sitting in a corner of the waiting room, her face drawn and her eyes red from crying so much. The nurses came for Frank around 8. They let us go in one by one to say our goodbyes. When it was my turn, I hugged him tight and told him I loved him, that I would be waiting for him, that he had to come back to me. He kissed me, caressed my face, and told me to be strong. Then the children went in, and finally, Aunt Sharon. When she came out of there, she was trembling. My daughters had to support her because it looked like she was going to faint. They told us the surgery would last between 4 and 6 hours. We all stayed in the waiting room, some praying the rosary, others talking in low voices, others just staring into space. I couldn't sit still. I would stand up, sit down, walk down the hallways, and come back. Time seemed to stretch on forever. 2 hours passed, 3 hours, 4 hours. At the 6-hour mark, a nurse came out and told us the surgery was taking longer than expected, that they had found more damage than they had thought. But the doctor was doing everything possible. Those words chilled my blood. More damage than expected meant things were worse than we thought. After 9 hours of waiting, the doctor came out. His face said it all. He didn't have to open his mouth for me to know the news was bad. He gathered us all together and told us they had done everything humanly possible, but Frank's heart hadn't held out. He had passed away on the operating table half an hour ago. They hadn't been able to do anything to save him. My world came crashing down. I felt like I was going to faint, like I was dying too. My children were screaming. Jessica fainted. Austin broke down crying like a small child. Emily was in shock, with a lost look in her eyes. I couldn't process what I had just heard. How could Frank be dead? How could he not be coming back? Just a few hours ago, I had hugged him, kissed him, told him I loved him. They let us see him after they prepared him. He was on a gurney, covered with a white sheet up to his chest. He looked peaceful, as if he were sleeping. I approached him and touched his hand. It was cold. That coldness was the confirmation that he was gone, that he had left forever. I collapsed on his chest and cried until I had no tears left. Aunt Sharon was in pieces. She was crying inconsolably, almost with more pain than I was. At that moment, I thought it was because she loved Frank very much, that they had developed a special affection in recent years. Several family members had to take her home because she couldn't even stand up from the pain. The following days were horrible. The wake, the funeral, all the paperwork. I was like a zombie, doing everything on autopilot. My children took care of most of it because I couldn't even think straight. The house filled with people, with flowers, with food that the neighbors brought. Everyone said that Frank had been a great man, a good friend, a tireless worker. There were over 200 people at the funeral. Reverend Davis gave a beautiful service at the church before we went to the cemetery. Several of Frank's friends spoke, told stories. Everyone was crying. When they lowered the casket, I felt like a part of me was being lowered too. My life with Frank was over. Now, I had to learn to live without him. Her 42-year marriage ends in tragedy, and all her suspicions are washed away by grief. Patricia believes the story is over. But what she doesn't know is that this death isn't an ending. It's the beginning of the real nightmare. Stay with us to find out what she discovers. The weeks after the funeral were the darkest of my life. I didn't want to eat. I didn't want to leave the house. I didn't want to see anyone. My children were worried about me. They took turns staying with me, but I just wanted to be alone with my grief. I cried at night, hugging his pillow that still smelled like him, looking at our photos and unable to believe he wasn't coming back. Aunt Sharon was also doing very badly. My siblings told me they had seen her at the cemetery crying at Frank's grave, that she hardly left her house, that she had stopped working. I was so deep in my own pain that I couldn't even worry about her. Let everyone deal with their grief as they could. A month passed, then 2. Little by little, I started to climb out of the hole. I began to eat better, to fix myself up a bit, to see my grandchildren. Life went on, even though Frank was no longer there. I had to be strong for my children, for my grandchildren. So I gathered my courage and decided to move forward, to honor his memory by living the best I could. 3 months after Frank's death, very strange things started to happen that made me question everything I thought I knew. It all began one day when I went to the bank to sort out some matters with Frank's accounts. I needed to transfer the money from his account to mine and close his account, as the lawyer had explained I should do. The young woman at the bank checked the computer and told me something that confused me. She said that Frank's account had been closed 2 weeks before his death, that he himself had come to close it and withdraw all the money in cash. I was frozen. Why would Frank close his account if he knew I would need that money after the surgery? I told the woman there must be a mistake, but she showed me on the screen. The account had been closed on April 1st, 2 weeks before the surgery. I left the bank very confused. I called Austin and told him what had happened. He was very surprised, too. He said maybe his dad had taken the money out to have it more readily available in case something happened, that he had probably hidden it in the house or given it to someone he trusted to give to me later. But no one had given me any money. That night, I searched the entire house for the money. I looked in the closet, under the mattress, in boxes, in the places where Frank kept important things. Nothing. There was no hidden money. It was almost $7,000 that had disappeared. Where was that money? What had Frank done with it? The following week, I went to the funeral home to pay the rest of the bill for the funeral service. I had already made a down payment, but there was still about $2,000 left to pay. When I explained to the man at the funeral home that I was there to pay, he told me I didn't owe anything, that everything was paid for. I told him no, that I had only paid the down payment, but he showed me the receipt. The full balance had been paid 2 days before the funeral, and it had been paid in cash by Mrs. Sharon Miller. I was speechless. Aunt Sharon had paid for the funeral. Where did she get $2,000? She lived off her pension, which wasn't much. She rented her little house, didn't have a car, and lived very modestly. How was it possible that she had that money? And more importantly, why would she pay for it? The funeral expenses were supposed to be my and my children's responsibility. I went directly to Aunt Sharon's house to demand an explanation. When I arrived and asked her why she had paid for the funeral, she got very nervous. She told me she wanted to help, that she knew I was going through a difficult situation, that she had saved that money for years and wanted to use it for something good. I told her I appreciated it, but that I was going to pay her back as soon as I could, that it wasn't fair for her to spend her savings. She insisted no, that it was a gift, that she didn't want me to pay her back. Something didn't add up. Aunt Sharon had never been generous with anyone, and now suddenly she was spending $2,000 on Frank's funeral. This right here. This was the moment. Doesn't that just sound absurd to you? A woman as stingy as Aunt Sharon suddenly paying $2,000 in cash, and Frank emptying his bank account right before a surgery that could kill him. Does any of that sound right? In that instant, my grief turned sharp. It turned into suspicion. I knew I had to find out what really happened. I started to suspect there was something more to it. Could it be that Frank had given her the money from his account to hold for him? But if so, why hadn't she given it to me after his death? A week later, I went to visit my brother Joey. We were talking about everything that had happened when he mentioned something that caught my attention. He said that a few days before the funeral, he had seen Aunt Sharon at the bank, depositing a large wad of cash. He was leaving as she was coming in, and although he tried to say hello, she either didn't see him or pretended not to. Joey found it strange because Aunt Sharon never had much money. I asked Joey what exact day he was talking about. He said it was on Thursday, April 14th, the day before Frank died. The day before. Something started buzzing in my head. If Frank closed his account on April 1st and the surgery was on April 15th, that meant he had the cash for 2 weeks. Did he give that money to Aunt Sharon? For what? That night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, thinking about everything. Something wasn't right. I decided I had to investigate further. The next day, I went to my children and told them everything. About the closed account, the missing money, Aunt Sharon paying for the funeral, and Joey seeing her deposit money. Jessica and Emily looked confused. They didn't know what to think, but Austin had a strange expression on his face. He told me he had noticed something odd, too. He told me that a week before the surgery, he had shown up at the house unannounced because he wanted to bring his dad some things. When he arrived, he saw Frank's truck parked outside Aunt Sharon's house. He thought it was weird, but didn't think much of it at the time. He thought his dad was helping her with something around the house, but now that we were putting all the pieces together, it all seemed very suspicious. Emily said something that broke my heart. She said that days before the surgery, her dad had taken her out to breakfast and had said strange things. He told her that no matter what happened, no matter what she heard or discovered in the future, she should always remember him as a good father who had loved her with all his heart. Emily didn't understand what he meant at the time, but now those words sounded as if Frank was trying to tell her something. We decided we had to talk to Aunt Sharon, all of us together, confront her, ask her to tell us the truth. We planned to go to her house the next day, but when we got there, the house was locked up. The neighbors told us Aunt Sharon had gone on a trip, that she had left about a week ago, and they didn't know when she would be back. That was extremely strange. Aunt Sharon never went on trips, not even to visit family who lived in other places. We waited a week, 2 weeks, and Aunt Sharon didn't return. Her house remained closed with the curtains drawn. We asked the neighbors if they knew anything, but no one knew anything. It was as if she had vanished from the face of the earth. I started to feel a horrible anxiety, a premonition that something very bad was about to be uncovered. I decided to hire a private investigator. Yes, I know it sounds like something out of a movie, but I needed to know the truth. The investigator's name was Mr. Coleman. He was an older gentleman who had been a former police detective and now had his own investigation agency. I told him everything that had happened, and he said he would help me find out what happened to the money and why Aunt Sharon was missing. Mr. Coleman began his investigation. He checked bank records, talked to people at the bank, investigated Frank's movements in his final months. A week later, he called me to his office and said he had information, but that what he was about to tell me would be very difficult to hear. I braced myself for the worst, but nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to hear. He told me that Frank had been withdrawing money from his account little by little over the last 6 months before his death. Small amounts of $200 or $300 that didn't attract much attention but added up to a lot of money. He had also found that Frank had been renting a small room in a neighborhood on the other side of the bay, like Daphne, a place far across town. He had been renting that place for 3 years, paying the rent monthly in cash. I felt like I couldn't breathe. Frank had a rented room? What for? Mr. Coleman told me we needed to go to that place, that we would likely find answers there. We went that same afternoon. He drove to the address. It was an old apartment building in a neighborhood I didn't even know well. We went up to the 2nd floor and knocked on the door of room number 8. No one answered. The investigator spoke with the landlady of the building and explained the situation. The woman, whose name was Miss Jenkins, told us that the room was rented by a man who came 2 or 3 times a week, sometimes staying all afternoon. When the investigator showed her a photo of Frank, she recognized him immediately. Yes, that was the man who rented the room. We asked her if he always came alone. Miss Jenkins became uncomfortable, as if she didn't want to talk. The investigator insisted, telling her it was important that I was the man's widow and needed to know the truth. Miss Jenkins finally spoke. No, the man didn't always come alone. He came with a lady, an older woman, about 60 years old. Sometimes they arrived together. Sometimes she arrived first and he later. They would lock themselves in the room for hours. With trembling hands, I showed her a photo of Aunt Sharon from my phone. I asked Miss Jenkins if that was the woman. She nodded her head. Yes, that was the woman who came with Frank. I felt the world collapsing around me. Everything started to spin. The investigator had to hold me because my legs wouldn't support me. I couldn't breathe. I felt like I was suffocating. Mr. Coleman gave me some W, my husband, the man I had spent more tater, and helped me sit on a bench in the building's courtyard. My mind tried to process what I had just discovered, but it was too much, too horrible to be true. My husband, the man I had spent almost 48 years of my life with whom I had 3 children, with whom I had built a family, had been cheating on me. And not with just anyone, but with my own aunt, my mother's sister. Tears began to stream down my face uncontrollably. I cried there, sitting while Mr. Coleman talked to Miss Jenkins, trying to get more information. I cried for the deceit, for the betrayal, for all those years that I now understood had been a lie. I cried for my mom, who had died without knowing that her sister and my husband were betraying her like this. I cried for myself, for the fool I had been, for all the signs I had ignored. Miss Jenkins told the investigator that the last time she had seen Frank was 2 days before his supposed death. He had arrived with suitcases, several suitcases and boxes. She thought he was moving into the room, but he told her he was just going to store some things there for a while. The woman, my aunt, was not with him that day. Frank stayed in the room for about an hour, locked it when he left, and told Miss Jenkins he would continue to pay the rent, but that he might not be by for a while. The investigator convinced Miss Jenkins to let us into the room. She went for the master keys and opened the door. What I saw inside completely shattered my heart. It was a small room, but furnished with a lot of care. There was a double bed with nice blankets, a small table with 2 chairs, a wardrobe, and there were even new curtains on the window. It was like a little love nest, a place where the two of them had been meeting for years. In the wardrobe, we found Frank's clothes I thought he had lost or thrown away. There was also women's clothing, dresses I recognized as belonging to Aunt Sharon. On the nightstand, there were photos of the two of them together, hugging, smiling. In one of the photos, they were at the beach. Frank had his arm around her shoulders, and they both looked happy. I had never seen Frank smile like that with me. There were letters, too, letters she had written to him. I read them with a broken heart. They said things like she loved him, that she couldn't wait to be with him, that soon they wouldn't have to hide anymore. One of the letters was dated just a month before his death. It said, verbatim, that the day was almost here when they could be together forever, that they just needed a little more patience. In the closet, behind some boxes, we found something that chilled my blood. There was a large suitcase full of Frank's clothes, neatly folded and organized. Another suitcase had Aunt Sharon's clothes, and in a box there were documents, passports, both with recent photos that I never knew they had taken. Bus tickets to the Florida Panhandle, somewhere like Panama City, dated for 3 days after his supposed surgery, and an envelope with a large amount of cash, which I counted right there. It was $5,000. The money, the clothes, the photos. That was one kind of betrayal. But the passports and the bus tickets dated after his death were something else entirely. This wasn't just an affair, this was an escape plan. My mind reeled, trying to connect the dots. The risky surgery, the sudden goodbyes, the will. It wasn't a man preparing to die. It was a man preparing to disappear. Everything started to make sense in a horrible, twisted way. The illness, the surgery, the death, it had all been a setup. Frank hadn't died in any surgery. Frank had planned to fake his death to run away with my aunt and start a new life far from here. That's why he closed his bank account. That's why he said goodbye to everyone as if he were going to die. That's why he settled all his affairs. It had all been an elaborate plan to disappear. When I saw those suitcases, the passports, the bus tickets, all dated for after the day he supposedly died, my mind just shattered. They were planning to run away. But if they were planning to run away, then the man I wept over, the man I put in the ground 3 months ago, who was he? Can you even begin to imagine the horror of that thought? This is the moment. The tickets, the passports, the photos. It confirms her worst nightmare. But this discovery opens up an even more terrifying question. If Frank planned to run away, who is the man in that grave? Don't go anywhere, because the truth is darker than you can imagine. But something had gone wrong with his plan. The suitcases were there, the passports were there, the money was there. If the plan was to leave, why hadn't they taken any of this? What had happened? Mr. Coleman told me something didn't add up, that we had to keep investigating because this didn't make sense. If Frank had planned to fake his death, then what happened at the hospital? Who was it that we had buried? I asked the investigator to look into the hospital records, to get the original death certificate, the medical reports, any official document of Frank's death. He said he would do it, but it would take a few days because he needed contacts at the hospital and the county clerk's office to access that information. In the meantime, I took all the letters and photos from the room. I wanted to read them calmly, to understand when this had all started, how they had fallen in love, how long they had been making a fool of me. The investigator also took the bus tickets and other documents that could be important for the investigation. I went home, destroyed. I called my kids and asked them to come over urgently. When they arrived, I showed them everything, the photos, the letters, what we had found in the room. My children couldn't believe what they were seeing. Jessica cried. Emily became furious and started cursing her father. Austin remained silent, his face ashen. That night I read all the letters. There were about 20 letters, written over the last 3 years. In them, Aunt Sharon told Frank how much she loved him, that she had waited her whole life to find a love like this, that she didn't care about the age difference or what people might think. She talked about their plans to go live in the Florida Panhandle, in a small town by the sea, where nobody knew them and they could live their love in peace. Frank replied with equally loving letters, saying that she was the love of his life, that marrying me had been a mistake, that he had only stayed for the children, but now that they were grown, he was free to seek his own happiness. Every word I read was a knife in my heart. It had all been a lie. Our marriage, the love I thought we had, everything. That night, after I read every last word, I wasn't just crying over the affair. I was mourning 48 years of my life. I had to just stop. I had to stop and truly accept the truth. The man I loved was gone, and in reality, he had probably never been mine at all. That was the moment I had to choose. Either lay down and die in those ashes, or find a way to rise up from them. Frank had been with my aunt for years, probably since my mom died, or maybe even before. All those times he offered to help her, all those phone calls, all those outings with the excuse of work, it had all been to be with her. One of the letters specifically mentioned the plan to fake his death. Aunt Sharon told him it was a brilliant idea. That way no one would look for them, that they could start a new life without any problems. Frank explained in another letter how they were going to do it. He was going to say he needed a risky surgery. He would enter the hospital on the agreed day, but at some point, he would escape from the hospital before the supposed surgery. A friend of his who worked at the hospital was going to help him get out without anyone seeing him. Then they would say he had died in surgery. But there was something that didn't add up. If that was the plan, what had happened? Why had they left the suitcases and money in the room? Why had Aunt Sharon disappeared? But Frank hadn't. Or maybe Frank did manage to escape and was hiding somewhere, waiting for things to calm down. My head was a chaos of thoughts. If Frank had faked his death, who did we bury? Or was the body Frank's? Had he really died by mistake? Or was it the body of someone else? Nothing made sense. I needed answers urgently because I felt like I was going crazy. On the third day, Mr. Coleman called me. He said he had important information and that I should come to his office. When I arrived, he had a folder full of documents on his desk. He explained that he had obtained the hospital records and had found something very disturbing. Indeed, there was a record that Frank Thompson had been admitted to the hospital that day for cardiovascular surgery. The records showed that he had been prepped for surgery, that he had entered the operating room, that the surgery had begun, but there was a note from the surgeon that was striking. It said that upon opening the patient, they had found the damage was much more extensive than previous tests had shown, that there was practically nothing they could do, and that the heart had failed just minutes into the operation. The investigator then showed me the death certificate. It was signed by Dr. Richard Wallace, who had been the surgeon. The cause of death was cardiac arrest during cardiovascular surgery. The body had been released to the funeral home we hired, and from there directly to the wake. There was never an autopsy, because the cause of death was clear, and the family, that is, me, had not requested one. But then the investigator told me something that left me cold. He had investigated Dr. Richard Wallace and discovered that this doctor had problems with the medical board. He had been suspended twice for irregularities in his practice. Furthermore, there was a lawsuit from a family accusing him of falsifying a death certificate years ago. The case never went anywhere due to lack of evidence, but the family insisted their loved one had not died and that the doctor had helped them fake the death. Could it be possible that Frank had bribed this doctor to fake his death? But then, whose body did we see, cry over, and bury? The investigator told me there was only one way to know the truth. We had to exhume the body and do a DNA test to confirm if it was really Frank who was buried there. The mere thought of digging up Frank terrified me, but I needed to know. I talked to my children, and after much discussion, they agreed. We went with the investigator to handle the legal paperwork to request the exhumation. They told us the process would take about 2 weeks to be authorized and then another 2 weeks to perform the procedure. While we waited, we decided to search for Aunt Sharon more actively. We posted notices on social media asking for information about her whereabouts. We asked all our relatives and acquaintances if they knew anything about her. No one knew anything. It was as if she had vanished off the face of the planet. Her house was still locked up. Her phone would ring, but she never answered. Her bank accounts had shown no activity since 2 weeks before Frank's death. An important clue came when a distant cousin who lived in the Florida Panhandle called me. She had seen the Facebook ad looking for Aunt Sharon. She told me she had seen a woman who looked a lot like Aunt Sharon in a small town called Apalachicola over near Tallahassee. She had seen her at the market shopping, but when she tried to approach her to say hello, the woman practically ran and disappeared into the crowd. I passed this information to Mr. Coleman. He hired an investigator from Florida to go to Apalachicola to look for her. After a week of searching, the investigator sent photos. It was her. It was Aunt Sharon. She was living in a small house on the outskirts of town, alone, using another name. The investigator said she had been there for about 2 months already, that she was renting the house and the townspeople thought she was a widow who had moved there for some peace and quiet. I asked the investigator to please go and confront her personally, that I didn't have the strength to see her yet, but I needed her to confess what had really happened. The investigator traveled to Apalachicola with the local PI. They knocked on the door of the house where Aunt Sharon was. When she opened it and saw the investigator, she knew immediately that she had been found. She tried to close the door, but the investigator stuck his foot in. He told her who he was, and that he was there on my behalf, that we needed to talk about Frank. Aunt Sharon turned pale. At first, she said she didn't know what he was talking about, that he had the wrong person, but when the investigator showed her the photos we had found in the room, the letters, she broke down. She burst into tears and said yes, it was her, but she couldn't talk about it, to please leave her alone. The investigator explained that if she didn't talk, she would face serious legal trouble, that she could be charged with fraud and other crimes. Aunt Sharon panicked and finally agreed to talk. What she said was recorded because the investigator was carrying a hidden recorder to have proof of everything. Aunt confessed that she and Frank had been. She said that at first they felt guilty, especially because Frank was married to me, her niece, but that their love was stronger. They started seeing each other in secret, first at her house when I wasn't there. Then they rented the room to have more privacy. She confessed that they had planned together to fake Frank's death so they could be together without anyone bothering them. Frank was going to say he was sick. He would go into the hospital, and with Dr. Wallace's help, they would fake his death. The doctor would give them a fake death certificate and an unclaimed body from the hospital to be buried in Frank's place. Frank would sneak out of the hospital before the supposed surgery. He would hide for a few weeks while the wake and funeral passed, and then he would go meet her in the Florida Panhandle, where they had already rented a house. Everything had been planned in detail. Frank closed his accounts, settled his affairs, said goodbye to everyone without raising suspicion. On the day of the surgery, he entered the hospital as planned, but this is where things went horribly wrong. Aunt Sharon started crying uncontrollably when she got to this part of the story. She said that what happened was something they never imagined could happen. Frank did indeed go into the operating room as part of the plan. The idea was that Dr. Wallace would say they were prepping him for surgery, and at some point, Frank would slip out a back door of the OR before the operation actually began. But it turns out that when they were administering the anesthesia to make it look like they were prepping him, Frank's heart had a terrible reaction. Frank did indeed have heart problems. That part wasn't a lie, but they weren't as serious as he had told everyone, or at least that's what he thought. When they gave him the anesthesia, his heart actually failed. It wasn't planned, it wasn't faked. Frank really died on that operating table, not from the surgery that never happened, but from the anesthesia they gave him as part of his escape plan. Just listen to that. He planned every last detail to fake his own death, all to run off with his mistress. And in the end, he actually died, right in the middle of his own wicked plan. You know, they say man plans, and God laughs. Frank could fool me, but he couldn't fool fate. What a cruel, bitter joke. What a twisted end. Frank planned every detail to fake his death and run away, only to die for real during his own escape plan. Fate delivered a justice Patricia never could have. But the story isn't over. Now, Patricia has to decide what to do with this horrific truth. Dr. Wallace panicked. He had a genuinely dead man on his table, not a planned escape, but a real death. He tried to revive him, but couldn't. At that moment, he had to make a quick decision. He decided to go along with the original plan and declare him dead as if it had been from the surgery, so as not to raise suspicions that something strange had been planned. No one knew the death wasn't from surgery, but from anesthesia before it even began. Aunt Sharon said that when Dr. Wallace called her on the phone that afternoon to tell her what had happened, she couldn't believe it. Frank was really dead. Not fake dead, but really dead. The whole plan had gone up in smoke. The love of her life, with whom she had planned to run away and start a new life, was dead, and she could do nothing. So, Aunt Sharon had to come to the wake and the funeral, knowing that Frank had really died, knowing their plan had failed, knowing they would never be together. That's why she cried so much, because it wasn't just the pain of losing a family member as everyone thought. It was the pain of losing the man she loved and with whom she was going to spend the rest of her life. After the funeral, Aunt Sharon was devastated. She used the money Frank had given her before the supposed surgery to pay for the funeral expenses as a way of honoring his memory. She stayed in Mobile for a few more weeks, but the pain was too much. She decided to go to the Florida Panhandle anyway, to the place where they had planned to live together, even if it was alone. She sold or gave away all her things and moved to the small town where she thought she could heal her broken heart. Mr. Coleman asked her about the room and why she hadn't taken the things from there. She said she didn't have the strength to go back to that place after Frank's death. That room represented all her broken dreams. She simply paid that month's rent and left everything there, thinking that maybe one day she would have the courage to return, but that day never came. When the investigator called me and told me all this, I didn't know what to feel anymore. Anger, sadness, relief that at least Frank was really dead and not out there alive and well, mocking me. It was a mix of everything. Frank had betrayed me in the worst way possible. He had planned to fake his death to run away with my aunt, but in the end, life, or God, or fate, or whatever you want to call it, had caught up with him. He had died for real while trying to escape his responsibilities. When the investigator gave me the recordings of Aunt Sharon's confession, I listened to them over and over. I cried every time I heard her voice talking about how much she loved my husband, about all the plans they had together. It hurt me to my soul, but at the same time, I needed to hear every detail, to fully understand the magnitude of the betrayal I had lived with for so many years. I gathered my children and played the recordings for them. All three of them were devastated. Jessica cried and said she couldn't believe her dad would do that to them, that he had planned to abandon them to run off with that woman. Austin was furious, punching the wall and saying that if his dad were alive, he would kill him himself for what he had done to us. Emily, the youngest, Frank's favorite, was in shock. She couldn't process that the father who loved her so much had been capable of planning to just disappear from her life like that. For several days, we processed all the information. I felt I needed to do something. I couldn't just stand by after discovering all this. But what could I do? Frank was already dead, really dead. Aunt Sharon was hiding in Florida, living with her guilt. Dr. Wallace, who had helped with the plan, could be legally prosecuted, but that would mean our whole story would become public, that everyone in Mobile would know what had happened. It was Jessica who made me think about things differently. She told me that what was important wasn't revenge against people who had already paid one way or another for what they did. The important thing was for me to regain my dignity, my peace of mind, and to close that chapter of my life in a way that would allow me to move on without carrying so much pain. She was right. I needed to do something that would give me back control of my own life, that would make me feel I hadn't just been a victim of circumstances. But I didn't know where to start. I was so used to being the submissive wife, the one who put up with everything, the one who turned the other cheek, that I didn't know how to be anything else. Mr. Coleman suggested several options. We could sue Aunt Sharon for the money Frank had given her, money that legally belonged to me as his wife. We could report Dr. Wallace for the falsification he had planned to commit, even though in the end, the body in the grave was indeed Frank's. We could make the whole scandal public so that people would know what kind of people Frank and Aunt Sharon were. But none of those options fully convinced me. Suing for money seemed petty. Money wasn't going to give me back the years I lost with a man who didn't love me. Reporting the doctor would cause a huge scandal, and my children would suffer the consequences of everyone knowing their father was a liar and a traitor. Making the scandal public sounded tempting in my anger, but it also meant exposing my pain and humiliation to the whole world. I spent several sleepless nights thinking about what to do. I would stare at the ceiling of my bedroom, the bedroom I had shared with Frank for almost 48 years, and wonder how many nights he had lain there, thinking about her, dreaming of running away with her, planning his escape. I wondered if he had ever truly loved me, or if I had always just been an obligation, the mother of his children, but not the love of his life. One night, around 3 inches the morning, I had a moment of clarity I hadn't had in months. I realized that what I needed wasn't revenge against them, but to reclaim myself. I needed to rebuild my identity, to discover who Patricia was without Frank, without the role of wife that had defined my life for over 40 years. I needed to do something for me, something that would make me feel strong, independent, valuable. The next day, I called my children and told them I had made a decision. I told them I wasn't going to sue anyone. I wasn't going to make the scandal public, but I also wasn't going to stay silent and pretend nothing had happened. I was going to make significant changes in my life, changes that would help me heal and start over. The first thing I decided was to go to the Florida Panhandle in person to confront Aunt Sharon, not to fight with her or to insult her, but to tell her to her face what I thought, to close that chapter head on and not like a coward. Mr. Coleman offered to accompany me, and Jessica also insisted on coming with me. I thanked them both, but I told them this was something I had to do alone. I needed to face my aunt without anyone protecting me, without anyone speaking for me. And I would also love for you to tell me in the comments what you think about everything I discovered. If you would have done the same thing I did or would have taken a different path. Your comments give me a lot of strength and help us all feel supported in this community. Well, as I was saying, I decided to go to Florida alone. I took money from my savings, bought a bus ticket, and one August morning, I headed to Apalachicola. The trip was long, about 5 hours, and the whole way I rehearsed what I was going to say. I practiced the words in my mind. I tried to imagine how she would react, what she would say back. I arrived in the small town around 2 inches the afternoon. It was a pretty, quiet place, with cobblestone streets and colorful little houses. It angered me to think that this was the place they had chosen for their new life, the paradise they had planned while lying to my face every day. I asked for directions to the house the investigator had indicated and walked there with my heart pounding. I knocked on the door. I heard footsteps inside, and then the door opened. There she was, Aunt Sharon. She looked older, more worn out. Her hair was completely white. She had lost a lot of weight, and her eyes held a deep sadness. When she saw me, she turned as pale as a sheet of paper. She froze, not knowing what to do or say. I looked her straight in the eye and said, with a firm voice that surprised even me, "We need to talk." She nodded her head, stepped aside, and let me in. The house was small, just one little room with a kitchenette and a bathroom. There was hardly any furniture, just a bed, a table, and 2 chairs. The walls were bare, except for a photo of Frank she had on her nightstand. We sat down in the 2 chairs, and there was a long, heavy silence. I looked at her, and she couldn't hold my gaze. Her head was bowed, her hands trembling in her lap. Finally, I began to speak. I told her everything I had discovered, everything the investigator had found out, everything she herself had confessed in the recordings. I told her I hadn't come to fight or to scream at her, though God knows I wanted to. I came because I needed to understand. I needed her to explain how she could have done that to my mother, her own sister, who had loved and cared for her all her life. How could she have slept with her niece's husband, looked me in the eye for years knowing what she was doing? How could she have come to my house, sat at my table, eaten my food, played with my grandchildren, all while betraying me in the worst way? Aunt Sharon began to cry. She cried and cried, unable to stop. Between sobs, she told me she didn't expect me to forgive her, that she couldn't forgive herself. She told me she had been selfish, that love had blinded her. She said that when she truly got to know Frank, Beyond just being her niece's husband, she discovered in him the man she had waited for her whole life. She said that for the first time in her life, she had felt loved, desired, important to someone. She explained that her whole life, she had been the plain sister, the bitter old maid that nobody wanted. When my mom died, Frank was the only one who truly comforted her, who sat and listened to her, who made her feel like she mattered. From there, something grew that neither of them was looking for, but that they couldn't stop either. At first, they resisted. They knew it was wrong, but the attraction was stronger. It started with a kiss, then sporadic encounters, until they couldn't live without each other. She said she always felt guilty about me, that she wanted to end the relationship many times, but couldn't. Frank would tell her that he didn't love me anymore, that he only stayed with me for the children, that when they grew up, he would leave me. But the years passed, and Frank never left, until they finally planned the only way out they could find, faking his death. I asked her if she had ever thought about me, about my children, about what it would do to us. She said yes, she thought about us all the time, but she also thought about her own happiness, about the years she had wasted being lonely and bitter. She felt she deserved to have love, even if that love belonged to someone else. She apologized 1,000 times. She told me she was tormented by what she had done, that Frank's death had been her punishment for being so selfish. I listened to her speak for almost 2 hours. I let her say everything she needed to say. When she finished, I sat in silence for a moment, gathering my thoughts. Then I spoke. I told her I understood that she had been lonely and sad her whole life, but that didn't justify what she had done. I told her there were plenty of men in the world. She didn't need to get involved with mine, with her own niece's husband. I told her the worst part wasn't just the betrayal, but the lie, the way she looked me in the face every Sunday at family lunches, how she hugged me at Christmas, how she told me she loved me. It was all fake. She had made me feel like I was crazy when I started suspecting things, that I was a paranoid and controlling wife. She had allowed me to doubt myself while she knew the truth perfectly well. I also told her something I didn't even know I thought, until it came out of my mouth. I told her that a part of me was even grateful to her for taking Frank off my hands, because now that I knew the truth, I realized Frank wasn't worth it. A man who was capable of planning to abandon his family like that, of lying to his own children, of faking his death to escape his responsibilities, that man didn't deserve my love or my tears. She could keep her memories of him. I didn't want them anymore. Aunt Sharon looked at me, surprised. I think she expected me to come in screaming, insulting her, maybe even hitting her. But there I was, firm, calm, telling her things to her face without losing my composure, and that, curiously, seemed to affect her more than any shout would have. I told her I wasn't going to sue her or report her, but I never wanted to see her again in my life. To me, she had died the same day Frank did. She was no longer my aunt, no longer part of my family. I was going to take all of Frank's things from the rented room, and she could stay here in this little town, far from everything, with her memories and her guilt. That was her sentence. To live the rest of her life alone with the weight of what she had done. I stood up from the chair, looked at her one last time, and left. I walked through those streets of Apalachicola back to the bus station with my head held high. Something had changed in me during that conversation. I no longer felt like the helpless victim. I felt strong, in control of my own life. I had confronted my aunt, told her everything I needed to say, and I had done it with dignity. This is the turning point. The woman who got on that bus is not the same one who is traveling back to Mobile. By confronting Sharon not with rage, but with dignity, Patricia just took her power back. Keep listening to see how she rebuilds her life from the ashes. On the bus back to Mobile, I was thinking about the next steps. I knew that confronting Aunt Sharon was just the beginning. Now I needed to make real changes in my life, changes that would help me rebuild my identity and my self-esteem. I had lived my entire adult life, nearly 48 years, being Frank's wife, the mother of my children. Now I had to discover who Patricia was on her own. When I got to Mobile, I told my children how the meeting with Aunt Sharon had gone. Jessica hugged me and told me she was proud of me, that I had done the right thing. Austin told me I was stronger than he had thought. Emily told me she wanted to be like me when she grew up. a woman who doesn't let anything defeat her. With Mr. Coleman, we made one last visit to the rented room. We collected all of Frank's things, the few belongings he had left there. We packed them in boxes. As we were finishing, I found a journal in a drawer of the table that Frank had been writing in. It was a small notebook where he had been jotting down his thoughts during the last few months before his death. I took the journal home and read it completely that night. It was painful to read his words, to read how he talked about his love for Aunt Sharon, how he felt trapped in his marriage with me, how much he looked forward to the moment he could be free. But there were also interesting things. There were moments where he doubted, where he questioned if what he was doing was right. There were entries where he mentioned our children, where he said he was going to miss them but trusted they would eventually understand. There was one entry in particular that caught my attention. It was from 2 weeks before his death. It said something like, "Sometimes I wonder if this is the right thing to do. Patricia is not a bad person. She never did anything wrong to me. She was just the wife I was expected to have, the mother of my children. Do I deserve to be happy at the cost of her pain?" Sharon says yes, that we all deserve to seek our happiness. But some nights I can't sleep thinking about the look on her face when she finds out. I hope one day she can forgive me. I read those words over and over. Frank knew what he was doing was wrong. He knew he was going to hurt me, but he chose to do it anyway, because his happiness was more important than my pain. That was the hardest truth to accept. It hadn't been a mistake. It hadn't been a moment of weakness. It had been a conscious decision to put himself first, regardless of the consequences for others. That night, I took the journal, the letters, the photos, everything we had found in the room, and I burned it in my backyard. My children were with me. We made a small bonfire and threw everything into the fire. We watched as the paper turned to ash, as the photos twisted and disappeared in the flames. It was symbolic. It was our way of saying that chapter was closed. When everything had turned to ashes, Emily suggested we do something more. She suggested that each of us say something, a kind of final farewell. Jessica was the first. She said she forgave her dad for what he had done, but she would never see him with the same eyes again. Austin said he hoped his dad had found peace, but that he had lost the respect he had for him. Emily, crying, said she loved her dad, but she hated what he had done, and that it would haunt her forever. When it was my turn, the words came from my heart without thinking. I said, "Frank, I gave you 48 years of my life, 3 beautiful children, a home, my loyalty, my love. I thought that was enough, but I was wrong. Now I understand that no matter how much I gave, it was never going to be enough, because the problem wasn't me, it was you. You weren't capable of valuing what you had because you were always looking for something more. Wherever you are now, I hope you found what you were looking for. I'm staying here, alive, with my children, with my grandchildren, rebuilding my life. Thank you for teaching me that I'm stronger than I thought. Goodbye forever." The 4 of us hugged, crying around the fire. It was a moment of collective catharsis, of letting go of all the pain and anger we had been carrying. When the fire went out, we stayed there in silence for a long time. Then we went inside, and for the first time in months, I slept peacefully. The following days I dedicated to planning my new life. I had decided I wasn't going to stay stuck in the role of the victimized widow. I was going to do things I had never done. I was going to discover parts of myself that had been dormant for decades. But I didn't know where to start. At 70, what could I do that was truly significant? I started with small things. I signed up for computer classes at the local community center to learn how to use the computer better. I had always depended on my children to send emails or look things up on the internet, but now I wanted to be independent in that. The classes were twice a week, and I was the oldest one in the group, but I tried hard and learned quickly. I also started going out more. There was a group of ladies at church who got together every Thursday afternoon to chat and do crafts. I had never gone because Frank didn't like me to be out and about much, but now Frank was gone, and I could do whatever I wanted. I went to one session and really liked it. The ladies were kind, chatty, and we made bracelets and little things to sell at the church bake sale. One of the ladies in the group, named Betty, who was about 70, I got along with very well. She was also a widow. While we were threading beads one afternoon, she looked at me with kind, knowing eyes that saw right through my polite smile. "Patricia, honey," she said gently, patting my hand. "I see you. You're carrying a pain that's not yours to hold anymore." I must have looked startled, because she just smiled. "My husband passed 5 years ago," she continued, "and for the first year, I was just a widow, a ghost. Then I realized he was a chapter times in my life, not the whole book. You've been given a blank page, child. Don't waste it writing his name on it." It was Betty who suggested I do something with my experience. She told me that the community center had a support group for women who had suffered betrayal. "Your story isn't a burden, Patricia," she said. "It's a lighthouse. Go be a lighthouse for someone else." Betty was right. I was just drowning in my own grief, so ashamed of what had been done to me. Her words, they were like a splash of cold water to the face. Maybe this pain wasn't meant to bury me. Maybe it was meant to help me save someone else. That's when I decided. I was done being a victim. I was going to turn my story into that lighthouse. That's when I realized my pain could be turned into purpose. At first, I was shy. I didn't want everyone to know what had happened to me, but Betty convinced me that sharing my story could help someone else. I went to the community center and spoke with the psychologist who coordinated the support groups. I told her my story, well, an edited version without all the most scandalous details. I told her that my husband had cheated on me for years with a family member, that he had planned to abandon me, but in the end, things had turned out differently, and I had had to learn to rebuild my life. The psychologist told me that my story was exactly the kind of testimony they needed in the groups. My first time speaking in the support group was in October, about 2 months after burning all of Frank's things. I was extremely nervous, my hands were shaking, and I thought I wouldn't be able to do it. There were about 15 women sitting in a circle, of all ages, all with their own stories of pain. The psychologist introduced me and gave me the floor. I started speaking slowly, with a trembling voice. I told them I had been married for almost 48 years, that I had believed I had a normal marriage, until I discovered my husband had been cheating on me with a close relative for almost 10 years. I told them they had planned to run away together by faking his death, but that he had died for real in the process. I told them how I had felt betrayed, humiliated, stupid for not having realized it sooner. But I also told them something more important. I told them that after the discovery, after crying and suffering, I had made the decision not to stay in the role of a victim. I told them I had confronted the person who betrayed me, that I had burned everything that tied me to the past, that I was building a new life for myself. I told them that if I, at 70, could start over, anyone could. When I finished speaking, several of the women were crying. One of them, a young woman of about 30, came up to me afterward and hugged me. She told me her story was different from mine, but she still felt trapped and without a way out. She told me that listening to me had given her hope that it was possible to move forward. Those words touched my heart. For the first time, I felt that my pain had a purpose, that it hadn't been in vain. After that first time, they asked me to come back and speak in different groups. I started going regularly, about twice a month. Every time I spoke, I felt stronger, more confident. My story, which I used to be ashamed of, was now my tool to help other women find their own strength. In November, I decided to do something more drastic. I decided to completely change my house. The house that Frank had built, where we had lived all those years, was full of memories I no longer wanted to carry. I couldn't sell the house because it was my and my children's inheritance, but I could transform it. I hired a contractor to remodel. I moved the master bedroom, knocked down a wall, and made it bigger. I painted all the walls in cheerful colors. Yellow in the living room, mint green in the kitchen, sky blue in my bedroom. I threw out all the old furniture and bought new, more modern, more comfortable furniture. I put up pretty curtains, pictures of flowers, and plants everywhere. The remodeling cost me a good part of the savings I had left after paying for the funeral and all the expenses, but it was worth every penny. When the work was finished, around February of the following year, my house looked completely different. It was no longer Frank and Patricia's house. It was Patricia's house. Period. My children were shocked by the change. Jessica told me the house looked beautiful, that it looked like something out of a magazine. Another thing I did was start working. Yes, at 71 years old, I decided I needed to have a job. Not so much for the money, although it's always needed, but because I needed to feel productive, useful, independent. An acquaintance from church owned a small convenience store and needed help a few hours a day. I told her I was interested, and she hired me. I worked Monday to Friday from 3 to 7 inches the afternoon. It was a simple job, helping customers, running the register, stocking shelves. I didn't earn much, about $400 a week, but that money was mine, earned with my own effort. I bought my own things without having to depend on the pension or what my children gave me. I felt proud of myself. In March, my oldest grandson, Jessica's son, had his first communion. It was a special day, and the whole family was gathered. During the party after the ceremony, I saw my 3 children talking with their partners, my grandchildren running and playing, and I felt a deep peace. Despite everything that had happened, there was my family, healthy, united, happy. Frank had missed it because of his selfishness, but we were okay. Jessica came up to me and said something I'll never forget. She said, "Mom, you look different. I can see it in your eyes that you're a different person. You're prettier, more cheerful, more alive." She was right. I felt different. I was no longer the submissive, quiet woman I had been for 40 years. I was a woman who had faced the worst and had come out on top. I was a strong woman. In May, something unexpected happened. I received a certified letter from a law firm in Florida. When I opened it, I was surprised. It was from Aunt Sharon. The letter, written by her lawyer, stated that she wanted to return the money Frank had given her before his death. It included a certified check for $5,000, which was the money we had found in the room and that she supposedly had kept. At first, I thought about not accepting it. That money came from her, and I didn't want anything to do with her. But then I thought about it. That money was originally mine. It was from Frank's account that he closed without telling me. It was my right to claim it. It wasn't a gift from her. It was a restitution of what belonged to me. I cashed the check, and with that money, I did something I had always wanted to do but never dared. I signed up for a group trip to Savannah, Georgia, to see the beaches of Tybee Island. It was a trip organized by the church just for senior citizens. It left in July and lasted a week. It was going to cost about $800, all inclusive. The bus, the hotel, meals, and tours. I had never traveled without Frank. Well, I had never traveled, period. In 40 years of marriage, we never went on vacation anywhere. Frank always said there was no money or no time. And now, I was going to see the ocean, something I had dreamed of my whole life. My children were excited for me. They helped me pack my suitcase. They bought me new clothes for the trip. The trip to Savannah was one of the best experiences of my life. There were about 30 people in our group, almost all older women, and we became very good friends during those days. I saw the ocean for the first time at 71 years old. I felt the sand between my toes, the salt water, the waves. I cried with emotion the first time I went into the sea. I couldn't believe I had lived so many years without knowing something so beautiful. We took pictures on the beach, tried seafood, went to see the sea turtles, and visited nearby small towns. It was a week of pure happiness, and the best part was that I was enjoying it alone, without having to ask anyone for permission, without having to worry about what Frank would want to do. I was free, completely free. After 42 years of living for someone else, that trip to the ocean was her first breath of true freedom. The old Patricia is gone. But what happens when you have to rebuild your entire identity at 66? Stay with us for the powerful conclusion to her story. When I got back to Mobile, I showed everyone the photos. My grandchildren couldn't believe their grandmother had gone into the ocean and swam. I couldn't believe it either. I felt like I had discovered a part of myself that had been dormant for decades. My sense of adventure, my curiosity, my will to live. With the rest of the money Aunt Sharon returned, I did other things. I gave $500 to each of my children, because that money belonged to them too, as an inheritance from their father. I used another $1,000 to fix some leaks in the house, and the rest I saved for future emergencies or to treat myself to other things. In September, I turned 72. My children threw me a surprise party at Jessica's house. They invited the whole family, my friends from church, my companions from the support group at the community center. There were about 50 people celebrating me. They sang happy birthday. There was a big cake, a local band. I felt so loved, so supported. During the toast, Austin asked me to say a few words. I stood in front of everyone with my glass in my hand and spoke from the heart. I told them it had been a very difficult year, but also a very transformative one. I told them I had discovered that it's never too late to start over, to discover yourself, to be happy. I told them I felt more alive and more myself than ever before in my life. Everyone applauded, and some friends were crying. That night, after everyone had left, I stayed alone in Jessica's garden, looking at the stars. I thought about the whole journey I had been on since that terrible day Mr. Coleman told me the truth about Frank. I had gone through so much pain, anger, humiliation, confusion, but I had also found strength, dignity, freedom, joy. I wondered what would have happened if Frank hadn't died, if his plan had worked and he had run away with Aunt Sharon. I probably would have been left shattered, not understanding what had happened, blaming myself. Maybe I would have lived the rest of my life as a victim, bitter and sad. But fate had decided otherwise. Frank died. The truth came to light, and I had the opportunity to choose how to react to that truth. And I chose well. I chose not to dwell in pain. I chose to confront my aunt and tell her everything I thought. I chose to let go, not for them, but for me, so I wouldn't have to carry that weight. I chose to transform my house and my life. I chose to seek new experiences, meet new people, try different things. I chose to turn my story of pain into a tool to help other women. Just over 2 years have passed since all of that. I am now 73 years old, just turned, and I can tell you that I am happier now than I was in my 48 years of marriage. I know that sounds strange to say, but it's the truth. I have learned to live for myself, to value myself, to not depend on anyone to feel complete. My life now is very different from what it was before. I wake up early, but not because I have to make breakfast for anyone else, but because I like to watch the sunrise from my window with a cup of coffee. I exercise 3 times a week with a group of seniors that meets at the park. I work at my friend's store. I go to the support groups at the community center. I take classes in things that interest me. In January of this year, I signed up for a baking course. I always liked making desserts, but I never had time to learn properly. Now I'm learning to make pies, decorated cookies, multi-layered cakes. My grandchildren are happy because when they visit, there's always something delicious fresh from the oven. I've even thought about starting to sell desserts to have a little extra money. I also joined a book club at the public library. We meet once a month to talk about a book we all read. It's incredible to discover the pleasure of reading at this age. Before, I only read the instructions on medicine bottles or recipes. Now I read novels, biographies, even poetry. My mind feels more active, more alive. In March, I went on another trip, this time to the Blue Ridge Mountains with a different group of ladies I met at church. We saw the fall colors, hiked up to scenic overlooks, walked through the small towns. It was another beautiful experience. I realized that I love to travel, to see new places, to experience different things. I'm saving up for the next trip. I want to see the Grand Canyon. My children are amazed by my transformation. Jessica tells me I seem like a different person, that I talk differently, that I even walk differently. She's right. I no longer walk with my head down and my shoulders slumped like before. Now I walk straight, with my head held high, with a smile on my face. I'm no longer ashamed to take up space in the world. Austin has told me several times that he's proud of me, that he loves seeing his mom so active and happy. Emily has asked me for advice for her own marriage. She says she wants to make sure she doesn't lose herself in the relationship like I lost myself for so many years. I tell her the most important thing is to maintain her own identity, her own interests, her own friendships. That love is beautiful, but it shouldn't be the only thing that defines who you are. A few months ago, in June, I received another letter. This time it was from Aunt Sharon again. It wasn't a legal letter, but a personal one written by her own hand, in her shaky handwriting. In the letter, she apologized once more. She told me her health was deteriorating badly, that she had heart problems and advanced diabetes. She said she probably didn't have much time left and wanted to leave this world, knowing she had at least tried to make things right. She said she understood if I never forgave her, that what she had done was unforgivable, but she wanted me to know that she lived with remorse every day, that not a night went by that she didn't dream of my mom reproaching her for what she had done. She told me the greatest punishment she had received was losing Frank just when she thought they were going to be happy together, and then losing her entire family because of her actions. I read the letter several times. I didn't feel anger or sadness, just a kind of pity for her. Aunt Sharon had sacrificed everything, her relationship with her family, her reputation, her peace of mind, for a love that ended in tragedy. Now she was old, sick, alone, waiting for death with no one by her side. That was her punishment, far worse than anything I could have done to her. I decided to write back, not because I wanted to resume a relationship with her that's never going to happen, but because I needed to close that chapter completely in a way that would allow me to live in peace. I wrote a short letter. I told her I had received her letter and appreciated her attempt to apologize. I told her I didn't hate her, but I didn't forgive her either, because forgiveness was something she had to find in her own conscience, not in me. I told her I hoped her last days were peaceful, that she found peace with herself. And I told her something else, that thanks to what had happened, I had discovered my own strength and had built a better life than I would have had if nothing had happened. That in some twisted way, she and Frank had done me a favor by showing me that I was worth more than I thought. I sent the letter and never received a reply. In August, I learned from a cousin that Aunt Sharon had passed away. When I heard the news of her death, I felt peaceful. It was strange, but I did. I had written her that letter, telling her I didn't hate her, but I didn't forgive her either. And that was the truth. She may have had Frank's love, but she paid for it by losing everything and dying all alone. That was her price. Me? I chose life. And in the end, I won. She died alone in her little house in Apalachicola. Her neighbors found her 2 days later. There was no funeral. She had left instructions to be cremated and have her ashes scattered at sea. None of my siblings went. None wanted to. I didn't go either. I had already told her what I needed to say when she was alive. When I learned of her death, I didn't feel anything in particular. Not joy, not sadness. I just thought it had been a wasted life. A woman who could have been happy if she had made different decisions. But those were her decisions, and she had to live with the consequences. I had chosen a different path and was reaping the fruits of my own decisions. In the support group at the community center, my story has become something of an example of resilience. The psychologist sometimes asks me to talk to women who are just discovering betrayals or who are going through difficult divorces. I tell them my story, and I tell them that yes, it's going to hurt, it's going to be very difficult, but on the other side, there is a better life waiting for them if they have the courage to build it. One of the most rewarding things I've done is mentor a young woman in the group. Her name is Angela. She's 42 years old. She found out 6 months ago that her husband was cheating on her with her best friend. She's devastated, confused, not knowing what to do. I've been with her through her process. I listen to her. I give her advice based on my experience. It's beautiful to see how, little by little, she is also finding her strength. Angela told me last week that I was her inspiration, that if I at 70 could move forward and reinvent myself, she could too. She gave me a plant with a card that said, "Thank you for teaching me that it's never too late to blossom." I have that card taped to my refrigerator, and every time I see it, it fills me with joy. That little card is the real trophy, isn't it? Patricia has done what so few can. She's transformed her deepest wound into a source of strength for others. Her pain now has a purpose, But her new life is about more than just helping. It's about her own joy and freedom. Don't go anywhere, as her journey is coming to its powerful conclusion. My grandchildren now see me in a different light. Before, I was just the grandma who made sweet potato pie at Christmas and was always available to babysit. Now, I'm the adventurous grandma who travels, who works, who learns new things. My oldest granddaughter, who is 15, told me she wants to be like me when she grows up. That filled my heart. In November, I'm taking another trip, this time to the Great Smoky Mountains to see the waterfalls and the historic cabins. I have everything planned and paid for. I'm going with a group of 20 ladies who call themselves the Golden Travelers. We are all women over 60 who decided we weren't going to sit around waiting for death, but that we were going to live life to the fullest. I also started writing. Yes, me, who barely finished 9th grade, now I write. I keep a journal where I write down my thoughts, my experiences, the things I learn every day. I thought that maybe one day I could write a book with my full story, not to become famous or anything like that, but so that other women can read it and realize that it is possible to move forward. The house where I live now is my sanctuary. Every corner reflects who I am, not who I was as Frank's wife. I have photos from my trips on the walls, plants everywhere, books stacked on the living room table. I have a rocking chair on the porch where I sit every afternoon to enjoy the fresh air and think. It's my space, my place in the world, and no one can take it from me. Financially, I'm doing well. With my job at the store, Frank's pension that I'm entitled to as his widow, and what I sometimes sell from my baking, I have more than enough. I'm not rich, but I don't lack anything. I've learned to manage my money, save for the things I want, and treat myself from time to time. I no longer depend on anyone financially, and that gives me a security I never had before. My friends from church, from the support group, from the baking class have become my new family. We support each other, we celebrate together, we cry together. A few weeks ago, one of them, Miss Dorothy, was widowed. We were all there for her. We accompanied her at the wake. We took turns staying with her for the first few weeks. I shared my experience with her. I told her it was normal to feel lost, but that, little by little, she would find her way. Sometimes I wonder what my life would be like if Frank hadn't died, if his plan had worked. I would probably be destroyed, wondering what I did wrong, feeling old and useless. Maybe I would have remained bitter for the rest of my life. But things happened the way they happened, and although it was painful, it led me to a better place. I'm not going to lie and say it doesn't hurt at all anymore. Sometimes at night, when I'm alone in my bed, I still think about the 48 years I spent with Frank and wonder how many of those moments were real. Did he ever love me? Were the smiles in the photos genuine, or was it all an act? I'll probably never know the answer, and I've learned to live with that uncertainty. What I do know is that those years weren't a complete waste. They gave me 3 wonderful children, 8 grandchildren whom I love with all my heart, and good and bad experiences that shaped me. I can't erase those years even if I wanted to. They are part of my story, but they are no longer my whole story. Now I'm writing new chapters, chapters where I am the protagonist, not just a supporting character in someone else's life. The other day, I was looking at old photos with Jessica, and we found one from my wedding. In that photo, I'm 22, Frank is 25. We both look so young, so innocent, so full of hope. Jessica asked me if it hurt to see that photo. I told her not anymore, that now I can look at it and just feel nostalgia for the young woman I was. That young woman who believed in fairy tales and in forever. I told Jessica that the young woman in the photo had to die so that I could be born. The submissive and quiet Patricia died the day I discovered the truth about Frank. In her place, a stronger, wiser, more complete Patricia was born. And although the process of that birth was painful, it was worth every tear. I want you to know something very important. If you are going through a betrayal, a deception, a dark moment in your lives, you are not alone. I know what it feels like to have your heart broken into 1,000 pieces. I know what it's like to question everything you thought you knew about your life. I know what it's like to feel that there's nothing left to live for. But I also know that on the other side of that pain, there is light, There is new life. There is hope. It doesn't matter how old you are. I was 70 when my world collapsed. Many people told me I was too old to start over, that I should settle for what I had, that at my age you couldn't make big changes. But I proved them wrong. At any age, you can start over. At any age, you can discover who you really are. At any age, you can be happy. If you find yourself in a situation where you feel you can't go on, where sadness is consuming you, please seek help. Talk to someone you trust. Go to support groups like the ones I visit. See a therapist if necessary. You don't have to go through this alone. There are many people who want to help you, who have been through the same thing, who understand your pain. Accept that help. Don't stay locked up in your house crying alone. Believe me, the first step is the hardest, but after that, everything gets easier. And if you are in a relationship where you feel you are losing your identity, where everything revolves around the other person, and you have been left in the background, please stop and reflect. Don't make my mistake of letting 48 years go by living for someone else. You have a right to your own dreams, your own goals, your own life. A healthy relationship is where two complete individuals come together to support each other, not where one person erases themselves to please the other. To all the women listening to me, young or old, I say this: you are worth so much. You are valuable for who you are, not for who you have by your side. Your value doesn't depend on having a man, on being pretty, on being young, on meeting the expectations of others. You are valuable simply for existing, for being who you are, for everything you have lived through and overcome. Don't wait for a tragedy to happen to discover your strength. Don't wait to be alone to learn to value yourself. Don't wait until it's too late to do the things you've always wanted to do. Start now. Take that class that interests you, go on that trip you've dreamed of, learn that new skill. Life is too short to live it according to what others expect of you. Live according to what your heart asks of you. And if someone betrays you, if someone breaks your heart, cry as much as you need to cry. Don't suppress the pain. Don't pretend nothing happened. Feel it completely. But then when the tears run out, get up, dust yourself off, look in the mirror and say, "This will not destroy me. I am stronger than this." And believe it, because it's true. For me, discovering the betrayal of Frank and Aunt Sharon was the worst thing that ever happened to me. But it was also the best because it forced me to change, to grow, to discover parts of myself I never would have discovered if everything had stayed the same. It removed the blindfold from my eyes and showed me that my life wasn't complete, that I wasn't happy, even though I convinced myself otherwise. Now, at 73, I can honestly say that I am happy. Happy in a way I never was in my marriage. I don't have to ask permission for anything. I don't have to cook if I don't want to. I don't have to be mindful of anyone's schedule but my own. I am free to be completely myself, without masks, without pretensions. Do I miss having a partner? Sometimes, yes. There are moments when I wish I had someone to talk to at night, someone to watch a movie with, cuddled up, someone to wake up with. But I no longer need a partner to feel complete. If one day someone special comes into my life, they will be welcome. But if they don't, that's okay too. I am enough for myself. My grandchildren sometimes ask me if I'm going to get married again. I tell them I don't know, that it's not something I'm looking for, but I'm not ruling it out either. If God wants to put a good man in my path, an honest man who respects and values me, then I will welcome him with open arms. But I will no longer settle for less than I deserve, just to not be alone. I would 1,000 times rather be alone and at peace than accompanied and in distress. The 48-year mirror I used to see myself in the reflection of Frank's wife has shattered. At first, I tried to piece that old image back together from the ruins. But the pain reshaped me. Those old beliefs, the safe walls I had built, have all collapsed. Now, I no longer see the world through a lens of innocence. I see it with eyes that are free, even if they are bitter. That ironic truth is what set me free. I realize now, I didn't lose 42 years. I was given the rest of my life back, to truly live as myself. That is the journey I want to share. If this story resonates with you, please subscribe to the channel, because every one of us has a hidden strength waiting to be awakened.